Hello and welcome to our series Redeeming Culture, Fireside Chats at Ivy Hall. My name's John Haas and I'm president of the International Institute for Culture, which is housed here in this magnificent old mansion. And we are very fortunate to have with us today for our chat a very famous Catholic apologist, author, Dr. Peter Kreeft from Boston College in Boston. So Dr. Kreeft, welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm very fortunate to be here.
Well, you are fortunate, but we're even more fortunate that you're here.
No, I'm more fortunate than you are. Let's argue.
No, we're more fortunate. It's good to have you.
There are better things to argue about.
And we'll get into those. But you spent some time here in Philadelphia. You're at Boston College now, but you had taught both at Villanova and at Haverford College, is that right?
Yes, and Rosemont and a few other places
really?
down here,
Rosemont as well.
moonlighting.
All here in the Philadelphia area. Oh, good. Well, we're going to talk about a blockbuster movie based on a blockbuster book, and that's Lord of the Rings. And many, many people have seen this film and have been moved by it, and probably as many have read the book, even though it's quite a long book. But before we get into a discussion of the books and of the film, I wanted to have a little background conversation of some broader themes. Our institute was established to evangelize culture. Now, there was a group of intellectuals in England in the early part of the 20th century who were also very concerned about reaching out to the culture that they were living in. And they were called the Inklings. Is that name familiar to you?
Yes, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Charles Williams. Sometimes T.S. Eliot joined the group, Dorothy Sayers. It was not an institute like this. It was just a bunch of friends. Mm-hmm.
And
they were powerful.
They were all intellectuals or academicians?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
How did they come up with the name Inklings?
It was just an inkling.
I see.
And they dealt with pen and ink. They didn't have computers or typewriters.
Oh,
so it was a double entendre.
Uh-huh. And where would they normally meet?
In the Bird and Baby, that is the Eagle and Child, a pub in Oxford, and sometimes in Lewis's rooms. Lewis was the one stable there. He was at every meeting. Mm-hmm. And Tolkien was at most of them. They read their books to each other. Actually, Lewis's Space Trilogy and The Lord of the Rings were written at the same time, and they read their books to each other, so there's some influence, at least a lot of Tolkien's influence on Lewis, not so much the other way around.
Now, both Lewis and Tolkien were academicians, right?
Yes.
Yes. What was C.S. Lewis's field?
Lewis's field was, he trained in philosophy, but he got a job in English literature. He wrote the definitive book in the series, Oxford History of English Literature, in the, I believe, 16th century. Tolkien got a professorship in medieval English, in Old English. I had a teacher at Calvin College who was one of Tolkien's students.
Really?
And he said he was delightfully eccentric. You could hardly hear him. The first day of the course, he brought in a wagon piled with all the books for the course. And he said, these books are out there now. At the end of this course, they will be in your heart.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And the last day of the course, he brought the same books in a wagon, and he dumped them out and said they are now superfluous.
So, but he had to prepare lectures, too. I mean,
yes.
He just didn't spend all his time sitting around writing.
Oh, no, and he had to tutor students. Mm-hmm.
Now, this great movie, The Lord of the Rings, is based on a rather large book that he wrote. In fact, we've got a copy of it right here. This is Lord of the Rings.
Which four distinct polls chose as the greatest book of the century.
Really?
In fact, everyone in the world, except the critics, thinks this is the greatest book of the 20th century.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's an incredible gap in our culture between the mind molders and the students, a values gap, a religious gap, a philosophy gap. Ordinary people are still ordinary, commonsensical, fairly wise, and fairly religious, and the critics are not.
Right, that's true.
So the critics hated the book.
Now, we know, Dr. Kreeft, we live in such a secularized society, and England itself is a frightfully secularized society. I mean, very few people even go to church anymore. Yeah. And yet, from this society, this culture, has come this great literature. How is this possible? And what promise does it hold maybe for the secularized society we live in?
It's possible because people like Lewis and Tolkien didn't pay much attention to newspapers. They read great books, that is, old books. They struck deep roots down into their past and into human nature rather than living on the shallow surface of fashionable ideologies. Mm-hmm. And they reacted on their society as best they could. They each did their own kind of evangelism naturally and intuitively. Lewis wrote what he was best at, debated. Tolkien wrote what he was best at. It wasn't a conscious program.
Now, do you think people read less today than they did in Tolkien's and Lewis's day?
I think so. They don't read as well, that's for sure. Even in the 40 years of teaching that I've done, I see a decline in reading ability.
Mm-hmm. So do you think maybe the movie is a way of achieving God's purposes that might not have been reached as effectively?
Well,
with the
certainly
book?
the movie will make more people read the book.
That's true too. That's true too.
And
right?
the movie is a magnificent movie, but the book is even better.
Mm-hmm. But so this is a way that God has chosen perhaps to bring his message that he was already delivering through Tolkien to a broader audience than would have been possible otherwise.
Yes, and Tolkien himself is one of these wonderful spies who can creep past the watchful dragons of familiarity and duty and evangelize the imagination first.
Now, Tolkien and Lewis were both committed Christians.
Yes.
But Lewis was Protestant, right? Anglican.
Yeah.
And Tolkien Catholic.
Yeah.
Now, were they really concerned about trying to spread the Christian message through their literature? Was that one of their objectives?
To be a Christian is to be concerned with spreading Christianity in every possible way, and since that was their work, they, of course, were concerned with that. They were not professional evangelists. They didn't usually write allegories. They didn't evangelize in a conscious way, although occasionally Lewis would preach.
But C.S. Lewis also, he wrote Mere Christianity. He seemed to write more books that were concerned.
Direct apologetics, yes.
Uh-huh.
But Tolkien made very clear that this was a fundamentally a religious and Catholic book, The Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings.
Even though the religion was not on the surface, but it was very deep in the depths.
Now, there's some discussion about the approaches of Lewis and Tolkien and whether there was a radical difference in approach. There's a term from literature called allegory. Can you tell us what an allegory is?
An allegory is a parable or a piece of symbolism that has one and only one proper meaning. Pilgrim's Progress is the most famous one. Each figure in the fantasy has a meaning in the real world. John is the Christian, the giant is despair, Promised Land is heaven, and so on.
Now, it's suggested that C.S. Lewis used allegory pretty directly in the Tales of Narnia, for example, that Aslan the lion is supposed to represent Christ.
That's a misunderstanding.
Is it? Mm-hmm.
Aslan is not a human being, he's a lion, and he's not on Earth, he's in Narnia. He performs a Christ function, he's a Christ figure, but he's not Christ.
What makes him a Christ figure?
Well, he does what Christ does. He's the son of the great emperor over the sea. He saves Narnia by his death. Lewis himself described Narnia as a work of the imagination in answer to the question, what would have happened if there were another world, and if Christ entered that other world, but not as the human person Jesus Christ, but as another figure, a lion. So it's a sort of a second incarnation.
Is Tolkien's approach in The Lord of the Rings as similar as Lewis's is in trying to say what would have happened?
No, Tolkien explicitly says in the beginning he's not writing anything like allegory. The book is what he called topical. That is, the universal principles in the book are applicable to many different times and places and situations in this world, but not just one. When the book was written, it came out shortly after World War II, a lot of people thought that Sauron is Hitler and the ring is the atom bomb and Mordor is Germany and so on, and Tolkien said, absolutely not. That's not my purpose.
But he did write it during the war years.
Yes, there's a deep influence there.
Yeah, the book is filled with battles and warfare.
Yes. And he himself served in World War I, as did Lewis, so he pulls on his own experiences. But it's not an allegory. It's symbolism. The difference between a symbol and an allegory is that a symbol has an infinity of possible meanings. There's no one limit to what you can get out of a symbol. So
Lord of the Rings then would be more symbolic then,
yes.
and therefore in a certain sense almost richer. I mean, more can be done with it in trying to get the Christian message across, I would think.
Well, for instance, it has three Christ figures in it, Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf, sort of the prophet and the priest and the king, and each of them in a different way die and rise. Mm-hmm. Gandalf literally, Aragorn through the paths of the dead, and Frodo through his submission to the ring. And there's certainly a parallel between what Frodo does and what Christ did. Mm-hmm. The crack of doom is Calvary, and the ring is something like sin.
Now, just before we leave the Inklings in this segment, were Tolkien and Lewis friends? Was there tension at all between the two of them? Did they support one another in their writings?
They were immensely supportive. If it weren't for C.S. Lewis, we would never read this book, because it was refused by publishers for something like 5 or 10 years, and only Lewis's encouragement, pushing Tolkien to keep trying and trying, got Tolkien to do it. He was a niggler, he was a perfectionist, he was a procrastinator, and he was a pessimist, so he never thought it would see the light of day.
That's remarkable. It took him 5 years to get it to a publisher,
More than that.
And now it turns out to be, well, by the lights of many, the greatest book of the 20th century.
Yes.
Well, it certainly says a lot for persistence, doesn't it?
Yes. Tolkien kept badgering Lewis to come all the way to become a Catholic.
Oh, really?
And that was the one topic Lewis did not want to talk about publicly.
Would he talk about it privately with Tolkien, though?
Well, on one occasion, according to Lewis's student Christopher Derrick in his book C.S. Lewis and the Church of Rome, at one point Lewis said to Tolkien, "Stop talking about this. You couldn't possibly understand. You weren't born in Belfast." In other words, a Northern Irish Protestant has such deep-seated prejudices that it's impossible to overcome them.
Impossible to overcome them.
But I think, this is just my suspicion, that God in his providence prevented Lewis from becoming a Catholic. He had every possible reason to do so. He was very sympathetic to things Catholic, just so that he could be a kind of a mediator between Protestants and Catholics, and kind of greasing the slide. So many evangelical Protestants have become much more Catholic because of Lewis. He's safe. He's not a Roman Catholic, so he's embraceable.
Well, you say safe. He's not a Roman Catholic. One of the things that strikes me about The Lord of the Rings is a lot of people pick that up thinking it's safe. I mean, I remember when I was a young man and the books were coming out, there were a lot of, how should I put it, young people who were countercultural and on the margins. The last thing they would have wanted to have done was to have embraced something of the Catholic faith, but they were drawn into these books in remarkable ways.
Well, that's not surprising. The Catholic faith itself is countercultural and on the margins.
Well, that's
We're in
true
the diaspora until the end of time.
That's true. Well, what do you think that had the particular appeal to those people that first were drawn to the books?
I think the fact that God and not Hollywood designed the human heart has something to do with it. The good, the true, and the beautiful just shine through so perfectly in the book that young people who are not influenced by whatever fashionable ideologies happen to reign in their society are naturally attracted to the book.
Who do you think is the strongest figure in the book? We're going to discuss
Sam.
that more. Sam.
Sam is the real hero.
Okay, good.
According to Tolkien himself.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah. We do know that The Lord of the Rings is what is called fantasy literature. What is that kind of literature? What's covered by a term like fantasy literature?
It's a rather vague term. It's not clearly defined, but it's highly imaginative literature. The storyline is something that we don't see happening in our world. Tolkien defined fantasy by the word magic. Some sort of magical element has to be present in it. And he described The Lord of the Rings as a kind of conflict between two magics. One is the magic of the ring, which is a magic of power and domination. The other is the magic of the elves, which is enchantment. And the two are so different that they form, in a sense, the fundamental philosophical conflict of the book. The Fellowship are enchanted by the good and the true and the beautiful. And that magic is a spiritual magic over their soul.
Now, the Fellowship are the
good guys.
The good guys.
The hobbits and the elves and the wizards. The bad guys, Sauron and his orcs, have the kind of forceful magic, the kind of prideful magic that the ring represents. Something like Adam's apple, control over even divine providence.
Now, the Narnia of C.S. Lewis is also fantasy literature.
Yep.
How would that compare to something like Lord of the Rings?
It's more fantasy in that Narnia is another world entirely. It's not Middle-earth. Middle-earth is just a name for this planet. So Tolkien's fantasy is a time fantasy. He imagines what may have happened in probably times before the flood, antediluvian times. Whereas Lewis's fantasy is, well, first of all, he wrote 3 space travel novels, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. So that's a fantasy in space. And in Narnia, it's another universe. You can't get there by a rocket ship. You get there through kind of magic, through the wardrobe or through a picture.
Yes, I remember walking through that wardrobe when I was
So do
young.
I. You walked through it too?
Yeah.
First time I saw it, I locked myself in it and felt the coats, and I couldn't get into Narnia, so I got out. And Clyde Kilby, who was there then, said, you know, that's what every 12-year-old does.
That's right. It's got to be back there, you know, that other world. There's another fantasy series of books that have been very popular of late, Harry Potter books. Now, how would Harry Potter compare to these other types of fantasy literature that we've talked about?
Well, I think they're largely harmless fun, except for people who take them so seriously that they get into the black arts. But Harry Potter's a good guy, and there's a basic moral tone to the books, but it's a much cruder magic. It's just a magic of doing things like Elizabeth Montgomery did on the old TV sitcom Bewitched. It's a magic of physical power over forces in the earth. There's not that much enchantment in it, I think.
But little Harry wants to do good, though, too.
Oh,
right?
yeah. And it's a good guys versus bad guys, and good wins over evil. So I think it's a pretty good thing, and it's well done.
But there's certainly no underlying Christian message that one would hope to get, that author hoped to get across the way Tolkien and Lewis may have.
No, and it's not as deep. It doesn't move you. It's worth reading twice, but The Lord of the Rings is worth reading 20 times.
One of the things that amazes me about Harry Potter is how children have just devoured it, who otherwise wouldn't even pick up the book.
Well, I think our society starves the imagination and starves magic and fantasy, so children naturally gravitate towards it.
Well, you probably have had little experience with video games because your children are older, but I think that's one way of trying to feed an imagination, but not in a wholesome way.
Well, I think most video games are not very imaginative. They're wish fulfillment dreams, as if you could be this great wrestler or this great race car driver. They're very earthy. Mm-hmm. But true fantasy gives you another dimension.
Not just higher things.
Yeah, not just bigger quantity, but bigger quality. The elves, for instance. The elves are halfway to angels. They're another species.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. I mean, how many species? We've got orcs, and we've got elves.
What incredible creativity! Not only does he invent a whole world with its complete history, but new species. Mm-hmm. And once he invents them, there they are, hobbits. Everyone knows what hobbits are and will till the end of time.
That's right. They're big, hairy feet.
And look at those elves. I mean, plenty of people have written about elves, but they're not convincing. Even Shakespeare, his elves are just cute little fairy sprites. These elves are formidable. These are really elves.
You really remember them.
You remember them and you believe in them.
Now, he even developed a language, didn't he?
That's how it started. He taught language. He's a philologist, which means a lover of words, a lover of language. And he invented a language, Elvish, and then he had to invent a species that spoke it, and then he had to invent their history. So he wrote the Silmarillion, which is the book of the history of Middle-earth, long before the events in The Lord of the Rings, first. And The Lord of the Rings was a spin-off out of that.
What would ever possess or lead a man to make up a language?
Well, he himself says that in 1917, I guess, or 1918, when he was in the trenches in World War I, he did it to preserve his sanity. Mm-hmm. Because here was a beautiful, ordered world that he could at least create in answer to this horrible, disordered world.
Oh, how interesting. I didn't know that. And from that came the Elves,
from that
and from
came
the Elves
everything
came
else.
the Silmarillion,
Yes.
and now it hasn't been quite as popular as The Lord of the Rings.
No, it's more severe. It doesn't have the leafy charms of The Hobbit. It's like a tree in winter. Mm-hmm. But The Hobbit was a book that he wrote. There was another cause to that. He was marking term papers, and they were very dull, so he scrolled in the margin the words, "In a hole in the ground lives a hobbit." And he said, "Why did I write that? What's a hobbit? How am I going to find out? The only way I can find out what that word means is to write a story about one." So he did. And thus emerged The Hobbit, which was very successful. I think it was published in 1937.
Yeah, we have The Hobbit here with us as well. This is the Hobbit, and this preceded The Lord of the Rings.
But The Hobbit is just a children's story, a very well-constructed children's story. But the publisher wanted a longer Hobbit, and that's how he got started on The Lord of the Rings.
Did he write it in stages? Would he complete a section and then sort of take a break?
He was a niggler. He was a perfectionist. It took him all his life to write the Silmarillion, which wasn't even completed yet at his death.
Oh, really?
It took him something like 20 or 25 years to write The Lord of the Rings.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
Now, the films have been tremendously popular. They've received acclaim from the critics. perhaps in some ways in which the books haven't. I mean, there are different kinds of critics, I suppose, literary critics and film critics. How faithful are these films to the books?
Peter Jackson, the director, tried to be very faithful. And in most things, I think he was. I'd give the films an A-. I think they're absolutely wonderful.
That's remarkable in terms of a film made from a piece of great literature.
Yeah, all the technological details are exquisitely perfect. The swords, the costumes, the sets, the setting. The choice of New Zealand as the setting is perfect. The acting is well done. The casting is well done.
And of course, Tolkien went into great detail in describing people, individuals, the costumes they wore, and so forth. So in a sense, they had a lot to work with.
I would argue that never in the history of the world has a movie had better special effects than The Lord of the Rings. The battle scenes are the best battle scenes ever filmed.
Oh yeah, they're absolutely remarkable.
Perfect.
Even when the spirits of the condemned come back to save the day, it's incredible how they did that. Of the three films, which do you think was the best?
The third one. Jackson himself said that Tolkien fans will like the third one the best. The second one the least because it changes the book the most. The first one is good. Hobbiton, which is hard to do, is very well done. I don't think the elves are quite successful. Nobody can really do elves. They're not quite ethereal enough. So Rivendell is not that well done. But the Hobbit holes are great. Mordor is great. Whoever did those sets is the best set designer I've ever seen. They're archetypes. They're in the collective unconscious of the human spirit. And then you see them, yes, that's exactly what I imagined it to be.
Now, with the third film being the most faithful, do you think it was most faithful to the book? You said you thought it was the best.
I guess so, yes. But even there, I'd have quibbles. There's things that were taken out for no reason. For instance, at the most crucial point of all, the Crack of Doom, where Frodo finally completes the task.
The task of
destroying the ring.
One ring to be destroyed.
In the only place that it can. He can't do that. The ring has too much power over him. And it takes Gollum to do it.
And
now,
Gollum is this wretched
little creature who used to be a hobbit like Frodo, but who's been totally corrupted by the ring. Frodo understands Gollum, because Frodo is humble and sees Gollum sort of as his own dark side. There, but for the grace of God go I. So Frodo spares Gollum on a couple of occasions, and so does Sam. Gollum is the one who completes the task against his own will by biting the ring off of Frodo's finger. Now, Tolkien says at that scene, Gollum stepped too far over the brink and fell. It's a perfect example of pride or hubris, like a Greek tragedy. In the movie, Frodo pushes him. There was no need to do that. And the point that Frodo and Sam sparing Gollum saved the world, the great virtue of mercy or pity, this could have been brought out more clearly.
Yeah, right. And it's rather lost there as depicted in that final scene.
Yeah.
As they go off at the end of the film, I mean, this is depicting eternal life and...
Well, that could have been better done too. The Hobbit's home is untouched by war. They just go back as if nothing has changed. They're sitting there in this tavern, holding steins and smiling lamely at each other for a few minutes. Their transformation is not shown from simple hobbits.
But in the book, the village had gone through some hard times itself.
Oh yes. Yeah. The war ends right at the door of Bag End, Frodo's home.
But the enemy was defeated there as well. But the town was not left unscathed.
The price that a victory costs was not shown as well, I think, in the film as in the book. Tolkien was not a simple good guys versus bad guys, good will defeat evil, black versus white optimist. He was deeply pessimistic, and he believed that there's always a price to pay for victory. And he showed that well in the book.
Yes. Well, and of course, our Christian faith shows that as well.
The price was incredible, yes.
Yes. Unspeakable.
Yes.
Which was the murder of God himself, if you will.
Yes.
That's right. So so that was a disappointment to you.
Yeah, but you can't have everything. It was 10 times better than I thought the movie establishing could possibly do it.
Well, the one thing that did seem to come out at the end of the book was that Frodo couldn't have done it. Now, in other words, we can't ultimately save ourselves from the clutches of evil.
Unlike most fantasy, this was not Pelagianism. This was not, I can do it without divine grace. All of the characters are flawed, even Gandalf. It's a biblical epic instead of a Greek epic.
Even Gandalf, the great wizard, who had given his life and came back, in a sense, remarkably transformed. But even so,
He was wise enough not to take the ring when Frodo offered it to him. He knew his limits.
some of the characters, I mean, there are now names that are coming part of our common parlance. I mean, Frodo, Sam, Gandalf. A lot of people have thought that these figures represented the Christ figure, the Blessed Virgin Mary, like there was the elf Galadriel. And she appears to Frodo when he's in great need. That this represents the Blessed Virgin. Do you see this kind of correspondence between those figures and the figures in our faith?
Yes and no. The figures represent something. They point beyond themselves, but they're not allegorical representations. They don't just represent one thing. For instance, Gandalf the wizard. He's an archetype. That is, in most myths, there's an old wizard, a wise old man. There's something universal about it. We all have in our imagination something like the image of a wizard. Many works of great literature have three heroes. One is the intellectual, like the wizard, like Gandalf, like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, or Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov. And one is the leader, the practical man. That would be Aragorn, the king. And that would be Captain Kirk in Star Trek. And that would be Dmitri Karamazov. And then there's the sort of the priest figure, the humble one who sacrifices himself, which is Frodo, and Alyosha Karamazov, and someone like Dr. Bones McCoy in Star Trek. So these do represent something in the human psyche. We all have a Gandalf in us and an Aragorn in us, and maybe we also have an elf and a dwarf in us, which is something like body and soul, or the angel and the earthy one. So they represent something, but not just one thing.
Now, who was your favorite character?
My favorite character is Sam. He was Tolkien's favorite character too, for the very simple reason that Sam is the most saintly. Sam is humble and loving, and he represents something like St. Teresa's little way. Mm-hmm. You just fall in love with Sam. He's even more saintly than Frodo. I guess most people identify with Frodo as the central protagonist.
Now, whom do you identify with?
I'll give you a surprising answer to that question: Sauron.
Really?
I'll tell you why. Look at the book. It's entitled The Lord of the Rings. Who is the Lord of the Rings? Sauron. He is the most important character in the book. He is the only one you never see. You never see his face.
Yeah.
Why not? Well, perhaps through fantasy, Tolkien is showing us something about ourselves. Maybe here is a face of ourselves that we never see. Now, I don't believe for a moment that most people like Sauron or admire him, unless you're a neo-Nazi or something. But what's the connection between Sauron and the ring? The ring is the central thing in the book. It moves Middle-earth. Well, Sauron forged the ring. Why? Because he put his power into it. He externalized his power. And if it worked, it would have been terribly successful. He would have conquered all Middle-earth. In fact, it didn't. It was his downfall. Have we done something like that? Does the ring perhaps represent not just science or technology, but the abuse of it, the faith in it? Why is it that we feel more impotent and weak individually now that we have such tremendous power over nature than we ever did in the past? Maybe we have done what Sauron has done. But
you don't, I mean, you're not a technologist yourself. I mean, you haven't forged great technologies, externalized that way. So why would you identify with them? Because
I and everyone else rely on them.
Okay.
If there were a catastrophe, a nuclear war, how many of us would survive? The Boy Scouts and the farmers, maybe. That's it. We just don't know how to stand on our own feet.
Well, what actually do you think the ring stands for in
Power.
the film? Power.
Power.
Now,
and the corruption of power.
Okay. But isn't it more the corruption of power? I mean, it seems there's a you couldn't help but think of the power of sin over us, of temptation, of the allure of our own weakness in the face of sin when you're...
But it's original sin rather than actual sin. Mm-hmm. It's something inherent in our psyche. Nobody in Middle-earth is powerful enough to avoid the destruction that the ring would carry over them. It's addiction. Mm-hmm. So it's too much power. Mm-hmm. But it's power over everything. even over death, it gives you a kind of artificial immortality. So, talking about the ethical implications of it, if our scientists ever do what they promise or threaten to do, namely use the Genome Project and breaking the genetic code to manipulate our very genetics and give us artificial immortality, that would be hell on earth.
Yeah,
that would be rotten eggs. And that's what the ring represents.
Yeah. And ultimately, they didn't control it. I mean,
they destroyed it.
Yeah, they had to be saved. They had to be pulled out of it by. In this sense, it was something behind the scenes.
It wasn't power that defeated power, because the Fellowship, the good guys, don't have that much power. Everything had to conspire together. If any one of 100 different events hadn't happened rightly, Middle-earth would have gone down the drain. So Tolkien himself defined the theme of the story in terms of divine grace. He wrote a letter to a Father Murray, and he replied, "I know exactly what you mean by the order of grace, and by your reference to Our Lady, upon whom all my small perception of beauty, both in majesty and simplicity, is founded. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work."
Well, that's quite pointed.
Quite pointed.
Yeah. Why do you think there were 9 rings forged? Do you have any idea? Did that represent anything?
Well, as a Bostonian, I like to think that's the Boston Red Sox, and the 9 Nazgul are the New York Yankees, but I don't think Tolkien had that in mind. I don't know the numbers. There's some mystical significance to the numbers. The fact that the elves have only 3, the smallest number, means that they're sort of the highest on the hierarchy. They have the most magic. And once the one ring is destroyed, they have to sacrifice themselves, leave Middle-earth, their magic is gone.
I see.
Which I think is Tolkien's explanation of the fact that our world doesn't have much magic in it anymore, whereas the ancient world seemed to have much more.
Well, if Tolkien himself says that this is a religious book, a sort of Catholic book without being explicitly Catholic, what does the book tell us about the world? You know, that we wouldn't get from other sources, maybe.
That it's a wonderful and terrible place, a place of striking beauty and danger at the same time, and that God hides himself behind different kinds of magic, enchantment and divine providence and strange coincidences, and that it's a sacramental world, that the concrete material things happen. There's nothing Gnostic or Platonic about this. In fact, in Tolkien's
nothing
letters...
pure spirit. I mean,
no. They have to fight. Even Gandalf, the wizard, who is a kind of archangel, he has to fight physically. The most striking passage in Tolkien's letters is this. He's complaining to his son Christopher about how much of a pessimist he is and how hard his life has been. And he says, "Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth. And more than that, death, by the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all. Yet only by the foretaste of this death can what you seek in your earthly relationships be maintained."
That's magnificent.
Isn't that?
Yeah, that's one of the most beautiful and concise paeans, songs of praise to the Eucharist I think I've heard. Yeah. Well, what does the book tell us about the human person?
Like most great classics, it opens us up to 2 dimensions, our inner heavens and hells. Like a giant, he stretches us on the one hand into possibilities of heroism that we never saw in ourselves. The hobbits, after all, are bourgeois, ordinary materialists like Americans, and they become heroes. On the other hand, the potentialities for destruction. Look what they could be. They could be Gollum, they could be Frodo. And the wizard could be Gandalf, or he could be Saruman, the corrupted wizard.
How would you see the theme of evil playing itself out in the book?
On the one hand, Tolkien takes evil very, very seriously. And even when good wins over evil, there's always a price. On the other hand, good inevitably wins over evil. It's a metaphysical necessity. Evil is self-destructive. So Sauron, like Satan in our world, destroys himself. If Satan had held back and not inspired Judas and Pontius Pilate and Herod to crucify Christ, what hope would we have?
So he defeated himself.
He defeats himself.
Yeah.
Judo.
Yes.
All you do is step back and help your enemy to defeat himself.
Now, a curious thing about the book, though, when we are saved by Jesus Christ, who was the great warrior on the battlefield of the cross, and as you say, outsmarted Satan. Satan outsmarted himself, if you will. But the redemption in The Lord of the Rings seems to come about accidentally. Gollum slipping off the cliff and falling into the pit of fire. That seems to lack something.
From the secular point of view, the crucifixion seemed to happen accidentally. Here was just some old guy in some hick town, some wandering rabbi who happened to bother the establishment and get himself crucified. Christ could have incarnated himself in Rome and become the emperor or a great warrior. Instead, he becomes something like a little hobbit.
So do you see in the books the action of divine providence going on all the time behind the scenes, even when it's not perceived?
All the time. Almost the very first thing that happens, as soon as Frodo takes the ring and leaves Hobbiton, for some reason that he can't explain, he wants to hide beside the road. A Black Rider comes at that point. If he hadn't hidden, the Black Rider would have gotten the ring, returned it to Sauron, end of story. Mm-hmm. Things like that have happened at least, dozens of times in the book until the ending.
So even Gollum's plunge into the fire, this didn't just happen accidentally.
Oh no, it's all predestined. It's free, but it's also predestined. Mm-hmm. And you see that in the Bible stories too. If many of the events in Old Testament history hadn't happened, the setup for the incarnation wouldn't have happened. For instance, if it hadn't been for that one cheap Egyptian tailor who wove Joseph's mantle in Egypt, all the Jews would have been extinct long ago, only because of that mantle, which was circumstantial evidence against Joseph, did Potiphar's wife get him put in prison. Only because he was in prison could he interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Only because he did that did he get up there in Egypt to persuade Pharaoh to buy the 7 years of grain, and his 70 relatives are saved. If none of that had happened, no Jew alive on earth.
So it ought to be a source, even the book ought to be a source of great comfort to us in terms of inciting in us confidence, trust, faith in
If there's
divine
any one
providence.
Bible verse that's illustrated by the Lord of the Rings, it's Romans 8:28. All things work together for good, even the worst things.
Mm-hmm. Which is not always seen. It's the eye of faith that has to see this happening.
Yes.
Who do you think is the man of greatest faith in the book?
Greatest faith?
That it's going to work out. Things will.
Nobody has faith that it's going to work out. It's desperate hope. Very little hope. There's no guarantee. There's just struggling ahead and doing your thing and let the chips fall where they may. It's not utilitarian. It's not calculating. It's not we have enough chances. You just do your thing.
I did want to bring up something you had said to me earlier, Dr. Kreeft, that you had said that one of the purposes of fantasy, according to Tolkien, wasn't related to the fantasy world, but rather to this one. How did he put that?
Tom Howard put it nicely in an article entitled Myth, the Flight to Reality.
Oh, that's marvelous.
A fantasy or a myth can plunge us into reality much more effectively than a realistic story, because in a realistic story we're forearmed against what the author wants to show us. We know ahead of time what he's going to say. In a fantasy, we relax. Oh, this is only fantasy. It's harmless. So he hits us in the imagination, and we can't help believing it.
Yes, okay. That's wonderful. The way in which it helps us come to grips more effectively with the very real world within which we live.
It's a little more like music than most literature is. You can't argue with music. Mm-hmm. It deeply influences your soul.
We had found that marvelous passage that you might share with us now from Lord of the Rings.
This is far from fantasy. The principles that obtain in this world, Middle-earth, this so-called fantasy world, are, I think, utterly realistic. Here's a little exchange. It wasn't put into the movie. I don't know why. When the writers of Rohan challenge Aragorn, and he tells them apparently fantastic stories, and the writer says, "It's hard to be sure of anything among so many marvels. The world is all grown strange. An elf and a dwarf in company walk in our daily fields, and folk speak with the Lady of the Wood and yet live, and the sword comes back to war that was broken in the long ages ere the fathers of our fathers rode into the mark. How shall a man judge what to do in such times?" And Aragorn's answer is, "As he has ever judged. Good and ill have not changed since yesteryear, nor are they one thing among elves and dwarves and another among men. It is a man's part to discern them, as much in the golden wood as in his own house. A ringing declaration of a universal morality, a natural law.
Yes, and played out so magnificently throughout the whole story.
Yes.
Is the dictates of the moral law. And even what transcends the moral law, taking us back to the Redeemer, the Creator and Redeemer himself.
Yes.
Okay, which shows us ultimately what the significance of the natural law is.
Tolkien himself said that this was a deeply religious work, and that's why he took all references to religion out of the text and put them underground, as if they were like the earth itself, and the story is just the top layer of soil.
Do you think that if he hadn't done that, you and I both know that there are some who are part of what might be called the cultural elite.
Yes.
That as soon
The
as
chattering classes.
The chattering classes. As soon as they hear anything about religion,
Of course.
it's like sprinkling holy water on a possessed man or a cross held up
Yes.
before a vampire. I mean, the reaction to it is so profound, visceral, that
Yes.
they can't even contemplate it. But Tolkien tricks them. He allures them and has them contemplating these profound transcendent truths.
It's not
through
really a
his story.
trick. He's not injecting religion into the story. The story is religious because the world is religious, so he just tells it like it is. But he subtracts it from the surface so that they don't trick themselves.
So they don't trick themselves, yeah. Now, I think I know your answer to this question, but do you think the book, do you think the films can become effective tools for the evangelization of culture, for bringing the gospel to the society within which we live?
Very powerful tools, because if we're not in love with something, if our imagination and our love of beauty doesn't click in, it's very difficult for a purely intellectual and a purely volitional and moral commitment to do very much.
So you would encourage a Catholic to read The Lord of the Rings, to go see these movies?
Absolutely. I think in our culture we've done a very good job in theology, in the intellectual realm. We've done a very good job in the moral realm. We've done a rather bad job in the aesthetic realm. Compared with the Middle Ages, Catholic art in the 20th century is moribund. And here is a great exception to it.
But not necessarily produced by Catholics.
Well, this is a Catholic.
I mean, Tolkien was, yes.
This is
I
a
was thinking
Catholic.
of the movies. And of course, the people who did the movies couldn't have done it without the creation of Tolkien.
And
so.
they, even though they weren't Catholic, they were honest enough and faithful enough to the book that most of it comes through.
So this is a great work.
This
of
is a
art
Gothic
produced
cathedral
by-
among books.
Oh, that's a marvelous way of putting it. I'd sort of like to touch on the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. And we can't be saved without them. Our culture's not going to be redeemed without them. And I was wondering how you might see those three, maybe we could just take them one at a time, played out within the book or represented in the book and in the movies. I mean, the theological virtue of faith, for example.
Faith here, I think, is mostly fidelity and friendship to each other. Emeth in Hebrew. They're true to their promises and they're true to each other. It's the fellowship, it's the friendship that is the strongest force. When they pick
we
the
have
fellowship,
that in the communion of saints, right?
Exactly, the communion of saints. At the Council of Elrond, where the 9 members of the fellowship are chosen, the 4 hobbits are included, including Merry and Pippin, who are at that point almost comic relief,
Yeah.
they remain throughout the movie. The movie doesn't really show how much they grow. And Gandalf says, I think it is wise to trust to friendship.
And of course, with fidelity, I mean, God remains faithful to us in terms of redeeming us and divine providence working through this story. There is that unseen friend, if you will, behind the scenes that is going to bring them to a
And even though
final
there's no
resolution.
God there, in a sense he is, of course, because if God doesn't exist, why is it wrong to play God and use the ring? But even though God is not a character, still Frodo's faithfulness and Sam's faithfulness to the task, which is a divine task, an absolute, this was absolutely necessary. They had 1,000 reasons for giving up and they didn't.
Well, and the awareness that there is a guiding hand behind all of this is clearly pointing
Yes.
to providence.
Yes.
What about hope, the theological virtue of hope?
I think the hope that good will triumph over evil is very strong and very clear. Hope that they will be successful is not very strong and very clear. They clearly distinguish hope in a rational, calculating sense, which is almost totally gone. Their chances are incredibly slim, from a fundamental hope. The most beautiful passage in the whole book, it seems to me, is the one where Sam, in the middle of Mordor, with almost no hope at all, looks in the middle of the night and sees a symbol of hope, simply a star. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountain, Sam saw a single white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For, like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach.
That's beautiful.
What a great passage.
Well, you went right to the passage on hope, or at least it beautifully formulates that in the novels. What about the greatest of these, faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest being love or charity?
Well, our Lord defined charity in terms of martyrdom or self-sacrifice. This is love, that you give yourself for another. And everybody in the fellowship, in a sense, gives themselves. Gandalf gives his life, although he resurrects. Frodo gives his whole self. In fact, he gives his life. There's a passage at the end, which is faithfully preserved in the movie, where he has to leave the Shire. The ring has too much power over him. And all his friends say, this is tragic. And he says, well, it must always be this way. I tried to save the Shire, but not for myself. Mm-hmm. My life for yours.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's curious, too, as they're going off at the end, and he's taking his uncle,
Bilbo, yeah.
Yeah, Bilbo, who's an old man now, and
Yeah.
who had the ring, had kept the ring, and he's unaware of what what had gone on and transpired, and he leans against Frodo and said, "Do you still have that lovely little ring?"
Sorry, Uncle, I've lost it. Must have lost it somewhere.
Oh, I just would have liked to have held it one more time,
Yes,
Yes. And it's just like the hold of sin is always there. I mean, right to the end.
Yes.
The spiritual writers always tell us that we must be aware of the allure of sin to the very end.
St. Augustine asked, what are the four cardinal virtues? Replied, humility, 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 and humility. And every one of the characters has the humility to recognize their limits.
So tell me, are you somewhat hopeful that, let me ask you this, you're probably somewhat hopeful that this movie, and leading particularly people to read the books, will have a leavening effect on our society and on our thinking.
It's bound to.
Mores.
It's bound to. But I think that's the wrong kind of thinking. Instead of saying, I'm going to calculate what's going to do the most good to my society, that's my end. All right, here's a means, the Lord of the Rings. All right, let me calculate now how much good that means can accomplish towards that end. That's not what they do in the Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. They do their duty. Mm-hmm. They do what divine providence and grace inspires them to do. And then they let the chips fall where they may. Mm-hmm. I think that's what we have to do.
Well, I remember hearing Archbishop Caffarra give a paper at a conference, actually, that I had organized, and it was on the question of conscience, but he was talking about the tough choices that human beings have to make, and he referred to the children of God escaping from the Egyptians. Mm-hmm. And they come to the Red Sea, and the water's in front of them, and the Egyptian hordes are closing in from behind. And he said, what do you do in a case like that? And he said, you go forward.
Yes, that's right.
They didn't know. There was no calculation there.
Exactly.
They didn't have to say, well, by the time you set your foot in, well, the water's going to start parting. No, you just go ahead and you don't see. And in a sense, that was our Lord, even in the garden, in his passion.
Yes.
That he wanted the cup to be removed. He didn't want to go on, and it must have been a moment of apparent despair, which you see over and over again, frankly, in these books.
In fact, without that apparent despair, without that dark night of not just the soul, but the mind, I don't think faith can be perfected. Mm-hmm. You have to not see in order to totally trust.
Was there an element in the books that you think magnificently articulated what we're talking about here? This utter trust in God and the willingness to surrender self to help transform, well, to be faithful, which would, not in a calculating sense, but it's going to bring about the transformation of culture. Was there any that was missed in the movie that you You kind of
Yes.
said in your heart, oh, I wish they had included that.
Oh, there were many such great lines. For instance, when Frodo and Sam and Gollum approach the Black Gate to Mordor, there are thousands of orcs in front of them, and there's no possibility that they can sneak in. And at this point, Frodo and Sam don't know that there's another way in. So Frodo is about to march forward. And Sam argues, "You can't do that, Mr. Frodo." Well, he says, "I am commanded to go. I know of no other way, and therefore I shall go." And at that point, Gollum says, "No, you can sneak in this other way," and feeds him to Shelob. But I am commanded to go, therefore I will go, period.
And this is a message to us, and that wasn't in the movie.
I think we Americans are so pragmatic and so calculating. If you ask a simple question like, why are we sending out missionaries? Or why do we pray? We usually give a reason, well, to get these results. But the reason should be we are commanded to do so, period.
And we are commanded to go. And,
Yes.
we are commanded to go out, preach the good news, evangelize culture, and show God's love in the world in which we live. And so I want to thank Dr. Kreeft very much for being here with us to help us enter more deeply into this rich literature and magnificent moving film. So thank you very much,
You're very
Dr.
welcome.
Kreeft. And we look forward to having you with us again for another series, part of our series, Redeeming Culture Fireside Chats. Thank you very much.